Okay. So yeah,
Intro.
there we go. Let's just like dive into this, shall we? Okay. So first of all, thanks everybody for joining the call. I'm assuming people will be joining the call during that. So I think one thing during this is like if you have a question, like definitely put it like within the chat, and I'm gonna keep my chat box open so I'll see that the whole time. So like if you have a question on a topic, like please just like put that in the chat box, and then like we'll ask that question um at the best, most appropriate time. Like if it's during that topic or if it's at the end, like during the Q&A segment. So if anything pops up that we're talking about, like please ask that question so we can get that answered. And everybody looks muted. So I think we're like ready to roll. So uh Kyla Chanel, thanks for coming on the podcast. She's with Nutritional Revolution, and I would call her like a very an excellent sports dietitian, sports nutritionist, and we're excited to have you on because we're a bunch of triathletes and we coach a lot of triathletes and endurance runners, and this is a great topic to talk about.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, okay, should we just dive right into this?
Fire away. However you
Okay.
want to start it, I'll follow your
Yeah.
lead.
Yeah. So I think, the topic that I think we don't talk a lot about is daily nutrition in season. I think so much of what we talk about is the race plan, the race carbs and sodium and all that. And we'll talk about that. But I think I want to spend the beginning part of this talking about in season daily nutrition, what you see a lot of people like maybe not doing as correctly. And I think diving into that, 'cause I think most people, yeah, we need like a refresher on that. So maybe you can just maybe go over like some common mistakes you see the age group athlete making in their daily nutrition.
Yeah. I mean, I have like a whole host of things come to mind for some things that many clients have come to me over the years. But I would say from a daily training nutrition lens, when you start to get into that in season, I certainly see a lot of people training in the morning and going out training fasted. And I would say many times that might be negatively affecting their potential to get those physiological training adaptations from their sport. So, and certainly from the lens of the female athlete, there's been quite a bit of literature there to suggest this could be detrimental and from a hormonal perspective as well. So we can get some suppression of estrogen, some elevation of cortisol, and we're not quite getting that adaptation again from the training stress that we would if we were fueled. So it can be something very small. I know a lot of people don't have an appetite when they first wake up in the morning, but I would say start very small. And what we will dive into today is your gut is very much trainable, and that has been proven and shown in the literature. So that's something we can dive into. But small could be half a banana or a couple bites of a banana. And then I would progress and build on that. So if you only have 15, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, start with something that's more carb dominant, because what we're trying to do is get that food and energy to empty quickly from your stomach and get into your bloodstream. It could be a gel if you like, if that's easy for you. It could be a handful of your kids' Annie's gummies, like, it's something simple that will digest and absorb quickly so you can get that blood sugar elevated so you can benefit from that in your training session. So you can have that energy to push harder in that session. So I think that would be one of the more common things I see from a mistake lens. But I think the other common thing we see, and I would say in almost, I mean, maybe 90% of my athletes, when we first assess their diet, they're almost always under consuming carbohydrates for what they're asking their body to do. And I think with the keto diet, alive and well, and the carnivore diet, alive and well, there's a lot of carb fear. And I understand that. But I think sometimes too, we forget there's like tons of really great real food carbs. This doesn't mean it has to be a bagel or a donut. It could be sweet potatoes and wild rice and couscous and um, I mean, goodness, oatmeal, like all of these things are fantastic, real food, nutrient dense carbohydrate sources that are great for our gut and our gut microbiome, but they're also great from a nutrient lens as well. If you compare that to like a white plain bagel, and there's a time and a place for all of these things too. I am very much like, there's no food that's a bad food. I think there's always a place for it, and a time and a place to utilize those foods. So I think those would be two of probably the more major things I see. And if we're in our day-to-day training, a rough kind of rule of thumb for calculating your carbohydrates could be at the bare minimum for triathlon, 4 grams of carbs per kilo body weight. So to do that equation, you would take your body weight, divide it by 2.2, and then multiply that by 4. That would be your bare minimum. Do you want me to give an example of like a 150-pound person?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so 150 pounds divided by 2.2, 68 kgs, times that by 4, it's 272 grams. So times that by 4, it's like basically it's 1,100 calories coming from carbs that one would be looking for.
And that's like base. So if you think about too, when you're getting, we call it like race prep or more specific training prep, you could be shooting for 7 to 8 grams per kilo. And if we talk about carb loading, you might be going as high as 12 grams per kilo. So certainly that is an area where, again, I see the majority of my athletes underfueling, but specifically so from a carbohydrate lens. And then the other macronutrient that I tend to see coming in a chai most often too is protein. And that's something where actually the dietetic standards are going back, and actually they're going to be updating the protein recommendation that was based off of the bare minimum Gen Pop would need to get to basically meet their body's needs at a baseline. But if we think about an endurance athlete, one of the big things we see in sport is we're oxidizing a lot of resources to create energy. And yes, that is glycogen, carbohydrates stored within the muscle, and some of that's free fatty acids. But a big piece that is broken down too are branched chain amino acids in endurance sport. So our leucine, isoleucine, and valine. Those are amino acids that are building blocks for protein, and we are breaking those down as a fuel source, primarily so more than any of the other amino acids when we are performing our sport. So we do need to make sure we're also consuming enough protein throughout the course of the day, and ideally evenly distributed. If there's weight loss goals, there's going to be some more specificity around that protein recommendation as well.
Yeah, so I almost want to go back to like the fasting aspect because I mean there's a couple like I think there are a couple key things in there that I thought that you said, but like the fasting aspect, and I think we can just sitting on you said that estrogen within women is suppressed and cortisol is suppressed in
Increased.
increased,
Yeah.
which is kind of interesting, right? So I mean two aspects like you don't want to go towards. So I mean, and then also the carbohydrate aspect, needing to get more in the morning and protein being too low. Like I know when we worked together, I mean, like the how you had that built out was it was almost as if protein never moved and we were like fluctuating fat and carbohydrate with the protein amount and even the protein amount was I remember seeing the number like wow like that's going to take some like serious work to kind of get to that level and but I can say like I think the effects that I saw for that were huge.
Yeah.
So do you see that a lot of people, I'll just ask this, like do you think that a lot of athletes that you meet are under fueling overall or over fueling?
A good question. I would say the majority of athletes that I work with, I want to say underfueling, but the other very interesting part with the sport, right, is your training changes every day and the duration changes and the intensity changes. And so, depending on how much time you're putting into that training, you could be putting out a 6 hour brick on the weekend. And then maybe there's a 45-minute swim. It could be like your lowest amount of time you put out. And if you're eating the same breakfast and the same lunch and the same dinner every day of the week, some of those days you got to be overfueling, and then some of those days you got to be severely underfueling. So we need to make sure we're making those periodized adjustments on the day to day to support those varying outputs. But overall, the majority of the times when we pull like a multi-day analysis, and take into consideration the training that's being put out in each of those days for our clients, they are coming in under at the end of the day. And the vast makeup of their diet is coming from fats, interestingly enough.
Why do you
And I
think?
get that. I get it because fats are so, our brain just lights up with fats. It loves it, right? It's very high energy. We just put out a lot of energy. Sometimes those fats are also nice and salty. So we're getting some salts with that. So peanut butter is a big one that makes up a lot of diet logs that I see. But um, certainly it gives us a lot of energy. So if we're in a big energy deficit, our brain's going to be seeking out what are those high calorie sources to help replace what was lost. And fats are 9 calories per gram versus a carbohydrate's only 4 calories per gram, and protein's 4 calories per gram. I've yet to hear any client tell me they're like craving a chicken breast after a training session. So it's typically a predominantly a fat makeup. Yeah.
Yeah. So like let's say you have somebody that is in season and let's say they're trying to lose ideally like appropriately, let's just say like appropriately they can lose 5 pounds, 8 pounds. Is it appropriate to try to lose 5 to 8 pounds? Like let's say what's June 1st and their A race is in September. Like,
Mm.
is it appropriate at that? Like how would you talk to an athlete like that? Because obviously they need to be in somewhat of a deficit, but yet they're training. I mean, how does one navigate that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I always ask the client what their number one priority is. Is your number one priority performance, or is your number one priority weight loss? And that can change in that time window, June to September. That's totally okay. And it does many times. But if at the time the number one priority is weight loss, we will lean towards that. Keeping in mind that then if it shifts, which I see it many times does shift towards, I want to perform well, I want a PR, I want to be able to go X minute per mile on the run, et cetera, that we want to start shifting back to maintenance intake, at least like the very latest 2 weeks before the race, but preferably 4 to 6 weeks before the race. So we can make sure we're giving your body all the fuel it needs and the recovery it needs. Well, we're in a tight window in that time, and we don't want to risk injury, illness, something like that, where we might have a shorter window of time to come back from to then race successfully. So looking at a weight loss goal, the other piece of that puzzle is if we're talking about still supporting your performance, minimizing the amount of lean muscle that you lose when you lose the weight, that we would want to make sure you're falling somewhere in a 0.5% to 1% max average weight loss per week. So if this person is 150 pounds, that's going to be 0.75 pound average loss per week on the low end, up to 1.5 pounds on the high end per week. And I say weekly average, that's a really helpful value for many clients to see. And a lot of apps don't really display it this way, but we hop on the scale and we see kind of this range a lot of times. 150, 151, 149.8. And then we can like go through a whole week and we're like, well, I'm back at 151. Like nothing's changed. But if you actually take an average of those values and compare it to the following week's averages, we might actually find you are in fact losing 0.75 pounds and you're on target, but it's perfectly natural and normal for your body weight to do this throughout the course of the week because you're going to be putting out different amounts of sweat. You're going to be peeing more. You might be taking more food volume as you should because it's a bigger training session. So more salt. There's going to be these ebbs and flows. It's natural and normal to occur, but we want to look at an average to assess that more accurately. So we're not jumping to conclusions and just taking one Sunday weigh in and the next Sunday weigh in. So you can run those numbers to see from a weight loss lens, if I want to lose 5 pounds, what does that equate to? If it's 0.75, that could be healthily 6.5 weeks to lose that at a comfortable rate. So just kind of thinking about that and giving those clients expectations of what's realistic is helpful, certainly, because I think a lot of people want to see that scale, like move really fast, but then their performance is sacrificed, or they're getting sick more often, or they're just feeling run down. And obviously, we don't want that to be the case either. So,
And
yeah.
this is going to sound like a kind of an easy question to answer, but I think like when we talk to athletes about weight loss, and I mean, obviously we're not dietitians, But the thing that I hear quite a bit is like they go instead of having it looked like a very planned, steady, like a nutritional program each week, they think, well, I'm going to lose weight. So today I'm going to do my big ride or my run. And after, I'm not going to eat for like 6 hours. And so they put themselves in a deficit. Like, yep, today's the day that I'm going to lose. But then what happens like the next day or the next morning is like the overconsumption is like massive to
Yeah.
where they never like they go through such polarization of highs and lows where and then when they're overeating, they just feel really bad about themselves because they've just consumed an incredible large meal to like, well, I'm never going to lose weight. And then
Hmm.
they starve themselves again versus like really planning it out or tracking and like being accountable to that. But I mean, if you're trying to say lose weight, I mean, how hungry should you feel? Like, like like should you feel starved? Should you feel somewhat like how do you know like if you're in an appropriate deficit to lose weight?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I would say there's a huge individual component to that. Um, Everybody's leptin and ghrelin, their hunger and satiety hormones, and how they're regulated and released have a bit of their own their own activity and agenda sometimes. Um, but certainly so talking about the protein, kind of jumping back to that conversation, if someone is wanting to lose weight, the when I should say, if someone just wants to improve composition at current weight, the current literature suggests a 1 gram per pound body weight of protein. So if you're 150
Hmm.
pounds, that's 150 grams of protein per day. If the goal then is to lose weight, then the recommendation jumps up to as high as 2.6 grams per kilo. So if that's a 150-pound person, we're looking at 177 grams of protein per day. So a little bit more than that 1 gram per pound. Another equation could be 2.6 grams per kilo of ideal body weight that you're trying to get to. So depending on where that individual is starting from, that might put your protein a little bit lower. Um, I'm trying to circle back to your main question.
Can I ask why though?
Yeah.
Like the protein aspect. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
just so people understand, and I don't quite understand it, but it's more why if you're looking to lose weight, we're not talking about a deficit, we're actually talking about protein. So
Mhm.
can you kind of run, I mean, I'm sure, but like why is protein such a key aspect to body composition, and fat loss?
Yeah. So the big piece of the puzzle here is I'm sure many people have heard of like yo-yo dieting, right? And where they lose a bunch of weight, maybe they lose it pretty rapidly, and then sooner or later that weight comes back. But actually, when we look at those 2 points in time of that individual from a composition lens, meaning say they started at 150 pounds, they got down to 130, and then over maybe the next 6 months, they got back up to 150. If we took a body composition scan of the person when they initially started at 150, when they got down to 130, and then when they got back up to 150, those two 150 weights might look the same on the scale, but the starting body weight probably had a lower body fat percentage, more muscle tissue to start, but they lost that weight so rapidly that they lost a bunch of muscle, and then their metabolism slows when they lose a bunch of their lean muscle because our muscle tissue is more metabolically active than our body fat. So then because their metabolism now is suppressed, they
Hmm.
start gaining that weight back, but that weight that they've gained back is primarily body fat. So unless they're doing a good amount of strength training and or consuming a good amount of protein in their diet. So talking about cutting weight or losing weight from a hunger lens, some could be like I've had a client where we decreased her calories just by 100 calories a week. So that's roughly equivalent to 1 apple a day. And she was famished. And I've had clients where um, I've made like a 300-calorie jump and they're like, this still feels like a lot of food. Like I'm really full. And so everybody is so individual. And I that certainly needs to be taken into consideration of like moving in a process that's comfortable with what their body's able to do, and they still need to function at their job and perform on the bike. And so we need to kind of still work with that. But protein, again, kind of circling back there is if we shoot for that 2.6 gram per kilo target, the key thing there is it's going to minimize the amount of muscle you lose through that process. So when you lose weight, it's very normal for us to see about a 60 to 70% loss of that total weight from body fat, and then a 30 to 40% loss from your lean muscle. So if you were to do body composition in bodies DEXAs, that's normal to see. It's not always the case, but that's a normal expectation. And then when we gain weight back, if we're strength training, eating enough protein, it's the reverse. So hopefully we gain like 3/4 muscle and only a quarter body fat. That protein keeping our more muscle on us, again, keeps our metabolism like kind of the things like burning hotter at rest, right? So we'll be able to keep our resting metabolic rate more active. The other big piece of the puzzle is if we think about our three macronutrients, so protein, carbohydrates, and fats, proteins cost us energy to digest. So if you're consuming 100 calories from a chicken breast versus 100 calories from white rice, you're probably, I mean, I should say you get about 90% of those calories from your rice that you consumed, and you're probably only going to get 60 to 70% of the calories you consume from your chicken breast because of the energy it costs to metabolize that thing. Fats, we get 100% of those calories. So those are very easy to assimilate and digest. So that's one piece of the puzzle. Costs more energy to break down protein. And so thus that's another means of energy expenditure to promote our weight loss. But the other big thing is protein takes longer to digest and empty from the stomach, meaning that it makes you feel full for longer and satiated. So you should not be experiencing these like blood sugar roller coasters and highs and lows with your energy. Should have pretty stable energy throughout the course of the day if you're getting regular doses of your protein in.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah. And so Michael asks, is it more beneficial to eat protein right before bed?
That's a good question. So you can. So from a sleep support lens, there's certainly nothing wrong with consuming protein before bed, so long as it's low in fat. So when we think about, like, say, within an hour before bed, consuming something that's a low fat protein source, so this could be egg whites, non-fat or low fat dairy product, a protein shake, those are totally fine before bed and actually can help support your sleep, according to the literature. You, again, just want to keep in mind that needs to be lower in fats, but you certainly should have a good distribution of your protein. So if you're trying to consume 150 grams per day, if your goal is improving body composition and stable energy levels and satiety because you're trying to lose weight, I would make sure that that protein is evenly distributed as best as you can, so long as those dose amounts are not affecting your performance because of that delayed gastric emptying response of protein. You probably don't want to consume 40 grams of protein before you're about to go do your interval hill run or something like that. But be mindful of that timing aspect. But outside of that, I would distribute it evenly, and you could have your last feeding shortly before bed.
Yeah. So I want to move on to carbs because you said that
Mhm.
carbs was a topic that you wanted to talk upon, and people have a fear of carbs, and like people, and is it, I mean, people, I think there is like this belief that carbs will make me fat, but yet fat won't, or however. And maybe some of it is like the fluctuation one might have when they eat carbs or so they don't. So if they don't eat carbs for a while, I've just lost 4 pounds. This is the greatest thing ever. Or carbs make me feel puffy, so I must be fat, right? Versus like it's
Mhm.
just so do carbs make you fat?
So short answer, no. No, that's a great question. They do not. Um, but carbohydrates are crucial for endurance performance and recovery and immune support and gut health. Like I could go on and on. Carbohydrates are crucial for that. So I think from a carbohydrate lens, there's this window post exercise, um, and it applies to many things from a carbohydrate lens. But a lot of the literature looks at immune system health. I'm sure many of you have done a race and you went out hard, and then the next day or two you get sick or under the weather. There's a big immune defense system suppression that occurs following just exercise in general, and especially the higher the intensity or the longer duration, there's a more significant suppression in that defense system. and it can go up to 6 hours that we're aware of. That's as far as it's been studied. But we can minimize that suppression with carbohydrates in that window, interestingly enough. And the literature has looked at carbohydrate consumption during exercise and or towards the end of your training session. One researcher said, if you're fueling with carbohydrates during your session, you're already starting your recovery process, which I thought that was an interesting way to look at it. But he's right, and you're always finishing your session usually in some form of a deficit. And so if we can get those carbohydrates in and minimize that immune defense system drop, we can protect our immune system a little bit better in that window after exercise. And there's actually professional sports teams that are no longer allowing their team to travel and get in the airport and on the plane in the 6 hours after practice because of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I had a question. So this is kind of like looking at like nutrition timing. And so like there's like two parts to this. But the first part of it is, the idea behind nutrition timing is if it's an easier day of training, off day or a zone one recovery day, I don't need as many carbohydrates. So, right, your protein will stay high, your macro distribution will change. But I think some of it is if you eat carbs at the wrong time, is that gonna negatively affect body composition, or does it mess with fat oxidation? Or because we're still talking body composition, right? I mean, so does nutrition timing matter? So if you're not working out, I don't need carbs at all because I'm not burning carbs, or what's your view on that?
Yeah, for the zone one stuff or the recovery spins or the like easy shakeout stuff, typically there's not fueling recommended during it, especially certainly if it's an hour or less. If we start to get into like 2 hours, maybe we want to include some carbohydrates, and maybe that's 30 grams of carbs every hour. But once the intensity and the duration starts to exceed that, then you want to start pushing that carbohydrate recommendation up. I will say too, talking about fat oxidation, that we actually see, so women across the board are better at oxidizing more fats than men if we compare them side by side. But certainly when women fuel with carbohydrates there's just as efficient fat oxidation utilization in their sport. And if we think too about the fat oxidation or metabolic adaptation, and we look at that literature where there's the train low, train high, sleep, all of these different variations. I will say that like through all of the summaries of like when they pull all that literature together, all of that was done on men. So I'll just put that out there. And that there was only one form of that strategy that seemed to be effective, not just from increasing fat oxidation, but actually also improving performance. So all these other methods and approaches, yes, increase your fat oxidation. Your body has to do that because you're restricting carbohydrates and still putting out energy. So your body has to get that from somewhere. But it did not improve their performance except for one strategy. So I think people need to keep that in mind as well.
But what about like during like daily nutrition, right?
Mm,
So, I mean, how much like do you need to like manipulate carbs
mm,
and fats throughout the day off of different training? So
yeah,
again, Monday you just come off of a massive weekend, it's a zone one or an off day, but you're just starving because
yeah.
you just had Saturday and Sunday and you've just demolished yourself. But you're starving. So, but how much distribution of caloric intake should your days look like, even though your days are different?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Typically, you're shifting your fat and carb ratios, which you're familiar with from our plant builds. Protein will remain the same. So if you're thinking about coming into a rest day or a very easy day, your ratio of carbohydrates will be slightly lower than it was on maybe a longer weekend ride day or brick or something like that, or higher intensity day. So you'll have a higher ratio of fats in your total diet. Calories will, of course, be lower overall because your output is not necessary. And so if there is hunger coming up on those days, I suggest of the carbohydrates that are allocated, really lean towards those fiber rich carbohydrate sources. So those that are richer in fiber are going to, again, similar to protein, hang out in the stomach a little bit longer, make you feel full for longer. And so that's going to be a lot of our fruit and veg. It could be your oatmeal. It could be chia seeds. Those are also an excellent source. They're primarily more fats, but excellent fiber source. So kind of leaning more towards volume and higher fiber that can help get that stretch reflex in the stomach, but you're still getting your carb goal for the day to help with that satiety. So talking about that hunger piece is like hoping we hit all our necessary targets on the days prior when it was a really big day, but if we're still feeling hungry, that could be the kind of layover effect of like we stretched our stomach literally for a larger volume to tolerate on that bigger day. And so now your stomach stretch receptors are expecting that similar amount of volume. And so we can give it that volume with fruits and veggies. Like if you look at the volume of 100 calories of arugula compared to 100 calories of a sweet potato, it's a big difference in volume that it's going to take up in your stomach.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I'm just gonna put it out there. Kyle and I worked together for like 3 to 4 months, and I think the one thing just before we move on to like more race specific stuff is up in like my goals going in were always like body composition, losing fat loss, and I think like the people who I worked with in the past, I mean, so much of it was about deficit, 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 to where I think I was down to like the person I was working with was trying to get me down to like say 1,800 calories. I mean, and they're like that was like so challenging. I mean, Cindy, that was not a great time. Like she was like, "You're a bear, you need to eat." I'm like, "Well, this is my goal, you know?" And it
Yeah.
was almost like the lower amount of food that I ate, the more weight I gained. And I was
Mm,
like, I am gaining weight and I'm literally eating precisely like 1,800, 2,000 calories. And like it's gonna work, it's gonna work, it's gonna work. Like I am literally gaining weight off of
mm,
such a deficit, but I'm training an hour and a half of the day, right? And like, oh,
hmm.
the trackers aren't accurate. I'm like, well, the tracker's pretty accurate, right? Like it's a power meter, like it's
Yeah.
measuring my kilojoules. And finally, then you were recommended by an athlete of mine. And the first thing we did is, I mean, I think my calories went up 1,000 to 1,200 a day. So I was
Wow.
eating all of a sudden like 26 to 3,000. And all of a sudden Cindy's like, wow, you have energy again. I'm like, oh yeah, I have energy. And I think within a month, I was down, I was losing weight, and I was eating 1,000 calories more a day. And I was like,
Hmm.
I'm like, it took like, and I remember like it took like a month, a week, 2 to 3 weeks. And I was starving at like 2,600 calories. And I think once we found that sweet spot, like the weight just came off. So
Hmm.
like with like how we worked together, it was almost like the exact opposite where I was starving myself and I was getting injured. I was sick. I was
Mm.
unhappy. But like the increase of calories and protein, like just shedded it. Like it just took it off. And yeah, I mean, it was the best thing. So it was like with my experience with you, it was not about how little can I eat. It was actually like a very good balance about that. So I think the last part on this topic is I have athletes that will say when I'm training for an Ironman or 70.3, I'm gaining weight. So how do people outside of caloric, surplus, but like, is it natural for people to gain weight during the season?
Yes. I see that happen actually. So what can happen is a lot of times there's a couple things. There's a mental side of this kind of like rebound effect of like, man, I just did, a really hard session. It felt really hard. I'm gonna go to the bottomless brunch like with my friend, after or something. There can be that, and we don't realize how much calorically we are consuming. Um, potentially after, certainly there's that. But I think another big piece of it is a lot of these individuals that start kind of gaining weight is that they're not consuming enough protein really at the end of the day. And so they are primarily relying on carbohydrate and fat sources for their diet. And as I mentioned, kind of back to the fats, is like when you consume 100 calories from fats, you're getting all 100 calories of those fats. Um, the whole other layer is alcohol. So depending on, how much is being consumed there. But if you are consuming alcohol often, alcohol is interesting in the way it's metabolized compared to a protein, a carbohydrate, or fat. It's actually most similarly metabolized like a fat. And what we see is if there's consistent alcohol consumption, you get really good at taking that alcohol and converting it into free fatty acids or fats. And you just become more and more efficient of taking resources and turning them into fats. So you're training your liver and body to convert stuff to fats. And so that is a big piece of the puzzle. And of course, then that can fall into like affecting sleep. And if we're not releasing growth hormone, then we're not recovering our muscle, and there's this snowball effect cycle. But certainly, if there's weight loss occurring, I think there could be the kind of like over guesstimation of expenditure and then kind of like quote unquote like treating oneself like I did this, which is fine. Or there's the I want to lose weight, kind of like what the example you had given where they don't eat for hours and hours after their session because they think that they're kind of staying in this like fat burning zone. But then they run into this like hunger wall where their body's like, you did not replenish my glycogen. I'm starving. And that can snowball into, more calories than you need, or you're on your rest day now and you're over consuming calories for your rest day. And so your body can put those away as body fat at the end of the day. And the protein piece, if we're not consuming enough protein, we can start to slow actually our resting metabolic rate. And then as that slows, then it's easy for the body to put on fat based off of consuming the same amount of calories. So just being mindful of that side of things as well.
And this is one thing I want to ask too is, we're talking about protein, and I think the one hurdle that I ran into is if I'm consuming 150 to 180 grams of protein a day, I had to move toward protein powder because it
Mm,
was just very low fat. I mean, I don't think there's any fat in it, obviously, but I mean, so when you're talking about is protein powder treated the same as chicken breast or salmon or Fage yogurt in terms of it's gonna you're gonna burn energy putting that in, or is it different because it's a powder?
that's a good question. From my understanding, you will still burn energy breaking that protein source down, but from a micronutrient lens, there's not going to be as many vitamins and minerals present in that source as there is in a yogurt or a chicken breast or something like that. So just keeping that in mind, balance with your no more than 2 servings of protein powder a day.
Okay. So um I want to move on to like race prep. So loading into races. So if you're like let's start with like a 70.3 distance. So can we kind of walk through what carb loading might look like? We can use like numbers because you said that you use the number up to like 12 grams per body weight. And I did the calculation. So for myself, that's like 3,200 calories of carbohydrates that I have to put in my system. But that you said that was a very high end number, 12 grams per kg. So can we kind of talk into like how many days leading into a 70.3 or a full that you want to start the load and like what that looks like?
Yeah,
Because
those are great
because
questions.
because in our experience, I mean, not a lot of like I think this is such an undervalued aspect where people think, yeah, I'm putting in carbohydrates and like they're really not. Like they're really consuming not a lot of carbohydrates, and then their runs are poor, they fall off on the bike. I mean, yeah, like so this is a huge topic.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're spot on in that. I've had plenty of clients where like I've run their numbers. I'm like, okay, you're gonna need to consume X grams of carbs per day. They're like, okay. And then they like start doing it and they're like, oh my God, if it's not hard to get down, you're probably not consuming enough carbohydrates. That's the big reality check that I would say almost every client has had their first carb loading attempt. So, and I call it an attempt, it's always good to practice. So if you're doing a race simulation or a long brick, 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks out from your race, practice your carb loading for that. So with the literature, there's been a handful of different carb loading doses and days out and different strategies. And there's been the like fully deplete, eat super low carb, and then load up. And then there's been a 1 day carb load, and then there's a 3 day carb load. And when we look at actual performance benefits, the literature suggests there's absolutely no need to deplete leading up. So you don't need to eat super low carb and then hammer the carbs. That does not seem to benefit from a performance lens. So the two scenarios I fluctuate between with my athletes are really just dependent on how much food can they get in, because the 12 gram per kilo recommendation is 1 day. You do it all in 1 day, and you actually would eat that 2 days. So if your race is on a Sunday, you're carb loading on a Friday, and then you're going to eat normally on a Saturday.
Hmm.
And 12 grams per kilo is a lot for a lot of people. So then the other recommendation that's just as effective is an 8 gram per kilo, but you do that for 3 days in a row. So again, if the race is on a Sunday, then you're doing that Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Running the numbers.
Why is
Yeah.
that you would take it 2 days before instead of the day before if you're doing that high dose?
Yeah, so what we want to do is we want to make sure, I'm sure many of you have probably also experienced this. If you eat a pizza or like, something heavy the night, and a pasta dinner the night before, that's probably still sitting in your digestive tract the morning you wake up. So it's actually not put away in your muscle as a fuel source. So we do it 2 days out because we want to make sure we have plenty of time to actually have all that food get through your digestive system, pulled into the bloodstream, stocked away as muscle glycogen. So you have it ready to go as a fuel source on race day, and you don't feel nearly as puffy or bloated coming right off of that loading day. And the other thing that can happen is if you do the 1 day load, a lot of people will feel tired on that loading day and potentially the next day. And then when they go to race, they can throw down the hammer. So that's the other thing you want to pay attention to.
Yeah, that's interesting. The thing that I took away is too big of a meal too late, where it's the night before I'm gonna have my full pizza, and then all of a sudden they have GI discomfort on race day because it's still sitting there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I looked at that. So 8 grams per kg, that's 2,400 calories of carbohydrates for my body weight. So I would take that in for 3 days leading into it, which seems pretty realistic.
Yeah. Most people can do that. And I will add to that is that recommendation, the 8 gram per kilo, is assuming you are resting those 3 days. So if you are doing some course recon, some, short warm-up runs, anything like that, you do want to bump it up slightly above that target.
Because I mean, most people ideally are training 30 minutes to 45 to 60 minutes a day. So 2,400 calories of carbs would actually, like you said, be too low because
Yeah.
you're burning through that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bump it up a little bit.
Yeah. So what kind of food would you recommend people look into, right? Because we know, I'm sure many of us heard like, in those times reduce fiber, right? So that almost makes me question like pizza, like as a pre-race, because how much of that pizza is fiber, how much of it is fat? And also like when are you eating that? But like, so is candy fine? Like is where is that balance of eating the type of carbohydrates you're picking to get in the system?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And this is an area I see a lot of athletes make mistakes. So when they hear me say carb loading, I think some of them hear just like high calorie foods, just eat all the high calorie foods.
Hmm.
And so they do the pizza and they do the chips and they do the ice cream. And unfortunately, all of those things are really high in fats, and fats delay gastric emptying. They make you feel full for longer. So what ends up happening is those individuals end up taking a vast amount of their calories in from fats, and they can't hit their carb goal because they're so full from all the fats. So you really do want things that are plain old carbs, not covered in oils or creams or sauces. You want plain white rice. And you want plain bagels, not with nut butters. I know it sounds boring. You want plain white potatoes, plain pasta. Those are the things you can do. You can do, sweet potato. Many of my clients will do some form of a liquid they'll add in. So if you want to do like a couple glasses like apple juice or orange juice or a mango juice, or if you want to do a smoothie or something like that further out from the race to get some more real food and nutrient dense carbs in, I'm totally fine with that. It's the one day before the race, you really want to drop those carbs. Certainly, if you're prone to GI issues, some people will do 2 days, like day one and day two pre-race, they'll cut the carbs really low, or sorry, fiber really low, to minimize the risk of GI issues. So that fiber is just creating bulk in your colon. And so then when you go to run, there's a lot of jostling and blood flow trying to go to the gut and dilute that. And so that's when we end up having those GI issues. But low fiber stuff would be a lot of the stuff I just mentioned: plain white bagels, plain white rice, plain pasta, plain breads, English muffins, those kind of things. Are pretzels is a good one, because there's like, you don't want to do chips because they're usually fried in an oil, but pretzels are usually low fat, and carb dominant, and they have some salt. They're easy for a lot of people to snack on. Cereals are great if you want to snack on a handful of like cornflakes, or, have some bowls of Rice Krispie cereal. Like, those are really simple, straightforward carbs. Yes, they're all from processed foods, the majority, right? But it is also kind of figuring out what settles with you the best. As an example, I did have a client where she's like, I'm just going to keep my life super simple. I'm just going to eat this like one bread for my carb loading like every day. And or maybe it was bagels. She got through like 3 bagels and she's like, I cannot do this. Like, so I think you want to be mindful and like have some variety. And then the other thing I see is a lot of these baked goods that have risers in them. So baking soda or baking powder, those seem to make it harder for people. Like, they feel more full. So again, the breads and the bagels and those kind of things. So trying to find things that are a little bit more dense without the risers, you can have a bit more success there.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I think about, like, if we're going to like a huge event or if you're traveling to an event, is planning ahead of bringing things, because, if we're talking about that, but if we're just eating out all the time, if we're eating out at these meals, I mean, how much of that is in fat, how much of it's in butter, how much of it is in
Right.
oil? I mean, long ago, like I remember this, I think it was like the first Ironman we traveled to. I think it was in Louisville, and I did not plan ahead. And we were in a hotel and it was so busy, where I think back on this and I shake my head. I mean, the amount of French fries that I ate in
Oh
the
no.
days leading into it, I'm like, I'm gonna get French fries. Like I think that's the easiest thing. And then like that race did not go very well. And because I'm thinking like that was like just so much fat that I put in my body.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, oh well, it's potatoes. Like, it's more fat than potatoes. But like that was very early. And I think Cindy was like, yeah, you're an idiot. But those kind of things. But
Yeah.
like, are you going to bring a rice cooker? Are you going to bring all these things ahead of time to plan for it versus just relying on restaurants all the time? Like, really
Mm.
bring things to make sure that you're prepared for that.
Yeah, I think that's huge, is like, with a sport like this, you are traveling often for your races. And so you want to find something that is portable and that works for your digestive system. So you're not finding yourself. I had a client, like, she was racing, I think it was Ironman Ireland, maybe, and she completely forgot her nutrition and was like carb loading with random stuff, and of course like had loads of GI issues because it was all new stuff to her digestive system. So if you find something like Ben's microwavable ready rice, that, throw that in your suitcase, or prepackaged little things of oatmeal in a Ziploc, and you can use the hot water from the coffee machine in your hotel room. I know it probably has a taste of coffee in it, but like, there's these little workaround things you can do. I've had clients buy freezer waffles and, from their location, and use those. So yeah, there's a whole host. And then like Bobo's toaster pastries, I think those have like 45 grams of carbs, and they're like about the size of an iPhone. So really easy to put down carbs, and you don't need to refrigerate them. So things like that, pretzels, cereal, every time you're eating, it should have carbs in it when you're carb loading.
So somebody asked a question, and it's a good one, is so when you're in like that 3-day carb load period, 2-day carb load period, I mean, like, where is the distribution of protein and fat? Because
Mm,
I mean, like, if you're eating normally
mhm.
and you're operating at like a really good level of training, everything's going well, but then you insert huge levels of carbohydrate. I mean, does that affect fat oxidation? Like for the race, like will that change things on race if all of a sudden your input of carbohydrates is just threefold to what you're used to? So like, do you keep fat and protein, or is it just get rid of it all, get the carbs in because you're eating 3,000-ish calories well, for myself, off my body weight? Like where's the ratio go there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you certainly don't need to increase your fats. Kind of bare minimum recommendation could be about 1 gram per kilo. So for fats, and you will see if you're consuming even just all these carb sources we talked about, you'll probably hit your fats without even trying to hit fats. So there's little bits of fats in all those things, and you're going to be eating so many carbs that those fats will naturally be hit, and protein might come up pretty high. Certainly for protein, you don't have to be at 1 gram per pound. I still try and get my athletes to shoot for it, but the priority at the time is carbohydrates. If you get 80% of your protein goal, I'm totally happy with that during that time. And it helps minimize a bit of those like blood sugar ebbs and flows if you're doing that carb loading. Because again, we're just like getting a big glucose spike and then we're coming down. And so that's why we can feel tired on those days and the next day. And if we pair some protein with it, it can help stabilize that a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then last thing is like the morning of the race. It's a half, it's a full, like how much should you be consuming the morning of? And also to forget it is how many people would say, I have a sensitive stomach, I don't like eating a lot. I mean, how do people like that navigate things? Maybe that's coming from the food they ate the day before, where they wake up and they just still have a lot in their track, but they haven't gotten rid of it. So, but morning of the race, like what does that look like in terms of how many carbs to get in? Is there still fat there? How long before the events? Like, can we walk all the way up until like the moment you get in the water?
Yeah, that's a good one. So kind of jumping back to the carb loading piece and preface of this, we store carbohydrates in our body in 3 places. We have it in our muscle as glycogen. We have it in our liver as glycogen in a much smaller amount. And then we have it circulating in our bloodstream right now in a much smaller amount. And so when we carb load, we are carb loading to saturate our muscle glycogen stores, the primary source of where we can store carbohydrates. When we wake up on race morning, assuming we didn't eat throughout the night and go to the fridge, our liver glycogen is probably, even though we loaded, is 50% depleted just to fuel us through the night. So race morning breakfast is to top off our liver glycogen. So with that race morning breakfast, it really varies based off how much time someone wants to wake up and give themselves to digest. I will say that your gut and your digestive system is very much on a circadian clock, just like your sleep and wake cycle. So if you're not used to eating at 3 a.m., it's normal. Your body's not going to feel hungry probably at 3 a.m. unless you start to train your system to eat at that time. If you can get nutrition in, you know, and override that sensation of not wanting to eat, but getting in a little bit of something, I would highly encourage it. The kind of recommendation and rule of thumb based off of digestion time is if you have 1 hour before race start, try and do 1 gram per kilogram of carbohydrate at your breakfast. If you have 2 hours, do 2 grams per kilo. If you have 3 hours, do 3. And that recommendation goes all the way up to 4 hours of digestion time. Go for 4 grams per kilo. If you've never consumed that much carbohydrates at your breakfast, I certainly would, again, practice it on your race simulation. Because you don't want that to be a new thing on race day is all of a sudden I've never consumed 150 grams of carbs per breakfast and now I'm trying to do it right before race. That's probably not going to go over well. So certainly practice that and see if you can work towards that goal based off of your expected digestion time. And then if you do have over an hour to digest, so say you have 2 hours before race start or before you're lining up at the start line, you probably want to add a little bit of protein and or a little bit of fats. And when I say a little, I mean maybe it's like a couple hard-boiled eggs, maybe it's a scoop of yogurt if you're going to go down that path. If you want a little scoop of protein powder, a spoonful of nut butter in your oatmeal or on a bagel, that's fine. We want to, and the purpose of that is to slow down that glucose release that you're eating. So if we're waiting 2 hours and we eat 3 bagels, we're going to spike our blood sugar and then it's going to be coming down well before we even get at the start line. And we're probably going to feel really slow to get going. So slow that glycemic response and drop down with a little bit of fat or a little bit of protein. So practice with that. And then 20 minutes before race starts is another thing that's been looked at quite a bit in the literature. They had athletes split them up in different groups and had them dose with 20 to 30 grams of a carbohydrate 45 minutes before race start, 30 minutes before race start, and 20 minutes before race start to see all their blood glucose responses and how they were falling or rising once they started their race. And the outcome of that study determined that those who are taking their last dose of carbohydrates 20 minutes before race start felt the best and performed the best in the first stretch of the race. So goes to say that essentially the blood sugar that they saw, the response was those that consumed it 20 minutes, their blood sugar was still coming up when they started their race. And so they're able to ride on that high glucose in the blood and utilize that as a fuel source, versus those that consumed it too far out from the race start. They get this rise and a crash, and then they start their race. And that's where you feel kind of like tired or like slow to get going and warmed up, that feeling. So if you're noticing that, try and consume your last like gel or something like that right before the
What if
start.
I'm taking a gel 5 minutes before the start? I mean, is there a negative effect to that versus like getting halfway through my swim and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I'm on cloud nine, or but I feel like, oh, I have a cramp. I mean, is there can you take something too close to the race start?
I think that's a gut training thing. So I have clients that'll take it 20 minutes out and another one right before. If it's like you think about a full, that might be ideal in that situation because you're not able to fuel during the swim. And again, we're really just trying to play catch up and minimize when we're fueling during the event. So you're always going to come out in a big deficit at the end of the day. So if we can get a little bit more on board, I think that's totally fine if your digestive system feels up for that, getting, horizontal in water, and you're not going to be, exiting back up the stomach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the last segment here is the actual race fueling plan. And so if I had to ask you what makes up a successful race day fueling plan?
That's a good question too. I think nothing new on race day. I'm sure everybody's heard that motto before. If you are going to use on-course nutrition, find out what that race is offering and practice with that in your training. I would say the other big thing is really make sure you're practicing with the amount and volume you plan to use on race day. So a big issue I see a lot of people run into is like, oh, I was practicing with Gatorade and Martins and all that stuff. But next thing you know, they were only practicing with one Martin an hour. And then on race day, they're trying to consume 3 or 4, and your digestive system's just not prepared for that, like physiologically. So you need to back up. I mean, we try and gut train people at least 10 weeks out from a race. So you certainly want to plan ahead for that. And then the big piece that kind of ties into that is the sweat testing and sweat sodium analysis, and kind of knowing what your losses are in different environmental conditions. So then you can go to that race and say, hey, when I sweat tested at a race pace effort in 60 degrees, I lost 30 ounces an hour. But when I sweat tested in 85 degrees, I lost 60 ounces an hour. You doubled your sweat rate. You need to know that when we're thinking about what kind of finish percentage dehydration you're comfortable with when we're thinking about your fluid intake per hour. And then you need to train to tolerate that amount of fluid and sodium as well. So that's a bit of math and calculating that we have to do on the back end, but you certainly can get sweat sodium data. And many people know like kind of a good sweet spot where they feel decent after, finish with a certain, a bottle an hour or whatever that volume is, but certainly plan to practice with that well before race day. And then from a carb lens, I'll just hit on that kind of briefly, but recommendations and athletes intake, I have one triathlete, he's consuming 180 grams of carbs per hour, 0 GI issues. So I think if you have some, lactate testing and then power testing and all this stuff where we know maybe what you're oxidizing to and what you're actually breaking down, it's not just filling up your digestive system and you're utilizing it, certainly we can train the gut to push to that much. So I think move progressively up towards where you feel strong and what's supporting you.
So then can we stick on hydration? So like hydration, sodium, I mean, because I feel like it's always kind of there, but like the role of sodium, the importance of sodium. I mean, can you take in, well, I'm sure you can, but like, can we talk about the role of sodium within your race day nutrition? Like how to know how much to take, what is too little, how to know when it's too much.
Yeah. So certainly if we did some sweat sodium testing, so there's different ways to do that too, and available to the public. So I would say like the most accurate way to do it and most affordable would be the Gatorade sweat patch. I have no association with them, but they've done quite a bit of literature comparison to the lab sweat sodium testing, the full body washdown method, and it is very comparable, the results. So that would be a method to utilize to understand your sweat sodium losses. So once you start to say they give you a value of 20 milligrams of sodium per ounce of sweat loss, you can take this value now and you can apply that to, okay, I lose 30 ounces an hour. Let's multiply 20 milligrams per ounce times 30 ounces an hour. That's what you're losing. So can we get that from a nutrition product potentially? And can we train our gut to utilize that? And usually if you're spot on and you get those right numbers with your sodium losses, you absorb it really well. So if you're over consuming sodium or you're under consuming sodium, we usually can end up with GI issues. So if we're under consuming salt, we're not bringing in enough salt to bind. There's a receptor in the small intestine lining that if you imagine like a door with two guards, and one guard needs a carbohydrate molecule and one guard needs a sodium molecule. And if you don't have both, it's not opening to let the water go through. So if you're coming in, you have your carbs coming in, so these gels that are coming out now, they're like primarily all carb and no salt. And you're not bringing any other salt sources if you're a salty sweater. We might just kind of overload those receptors with carbohydrates and they're not opening. Now what's happening is the body actually has to push water into the small intestine. So from the blood and there's salt in our blood to help dilute this thing to then pull it across the intestinal barrier. So that's where we can get the like diarrhea or the stomach sloshing sensation, those kind of things feeling going on. And then if you're over consuming salt, you'll feel like the puffy fingers, puffy feet and toes, that kind of stuff. And so you kind of want to find that, you do want to find that sweet spot of what is suited for you and then try and keep that as consistent as possible through the race. I know it's not the most straightforward answer, but it is so individual.
Yeah. Do you find that like is there a difference in the level of sodium need per bike and run, or can you kind of carry across sodium intake? Yep, I'm going to take in 800 milligrams per hour on the bike. I want to shoot that for the run. Or is it because, yep, it's hotter on the run, I might need more? Or like how do you, and ventilation's less, you're going to sweat more on the run. Like how does that operate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when we sweat test with our clients, we have them sweat test on a bike and we have them sweat test on a run. And most times we do see them have a higher sweat loss on the run, whether that's even if it's in the same temperature and taken on different days, right? And so we do want to account for that in the race overall. And you are sweating when you're swimming. We don't realize that, but we are sweating when we're swimming. And so we want to take that into consideration as well of the whole race duration. And can we, from a digestion perspective, potentially front load that a little bit on the bike? So we're not having to consume maybe as much fluid volume or as much salt on the run, but overall we have this whole picture average that's being front loaded a little bit towards the bike.
Yeah. And then, but on the hydration aspect, can we talk about like core temperature, uh, GI discomfort, cramping, like
Yeah.
how that affects how that might affect. Yeah, yeah.
Your salt requirements potentially?
And
Or
hydration, yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So the cramping piece isn't, if we're talking about muscle cramping, it's an interesting one in that the literature really doesn't know what causes a cramp, but they have this theory of all these different things that potentially could cause a cramp. Certainly hydration and electrolyte composition is one of those things. It could be you're using new shoes. It could be the mechanics. It could be muscle fatigue. So there's so many factors that could cause a cramp. But yes, we certainly could look at the hydration and the electrolyte composition for that reason. So if you are cramping, it could be we're under. It's typically not that we are over salting. We could be overhydrating without enough salt. So are we overloading with plain water and not bringing enough salt? That's also, we can get puffy fingers. So we're pushing the water actually extracellularly. So it's trying to come into the body. It's not going into the cell, or it's the cell's overloaded. So then it's pushing extracellularly, and that's when we get that edema. So certainly something to kind of be mindful there. And then from core temperature lens, hydration is huge, right? And so a lot of the literature up to this point has looked at if you exceed 3% dehydrated at your finish, then you risk performance, and we'll see performance declines because your core temperature becomes elevated and things like that. If you look at Kipchoge, who just did was a sub 2 hour marathon, he lost 10% of his body weight. So what we're starting to understand is that it's individual. I know it's like, so not the answer a lot of people want, but once you start sweat testing yourself and seeing what percent dehydrated you finish at comfortably and still feel strong, that's our indicator. And you certainly could train to tolerate a higher level of dehydration according to Kipchoge's situation, right? So there's that sweet spot. You probably don't want to push it too much. Again, the literature suggests not exceeding 3. I have an athlete right now. She does not want to exceed 0.5%, 0.5. So, that's where she feels her strongest. So you have to figure out what that is. And if you can maintain that hydration, you feel strong at that, you shouldn't increase your risk of overheating. But certainly if you are not bringing in enough fluids and enough salt, and your core temperature is starting to become elevated, that's when we get that your body has this blood flow fight. Basically, your body prioritizes cooling you over trying to digest and absorb your food or fluids. And so the blood flow, the little that you have, because your blood volume is down because you're dehydrated, is going to go to the surface of the skin to try and create sweat to off the heat and cool you. And with that lack of blood flow to the gut, that's when we can start to get like major GI distress, nausea, no desire to take in more nutrition or fluids. And it kind of becomes this spiral. We let our hydration get too low, core temperature came up, now we can't take in food or fluids. And so it, again, kind of starts to snowball. Does
Yeah.
that answer your question?
Yeah. I want to send the carbs just for one hot moment here, is like recommendations though of carbohydrates in terms of grams. So
Mm.
I think a lot of us are aware that with a lot of the products that you can safely take in more carbohydrates than what we thought. So I mean, like, what would be like a lower limit? Does it depend on body weight per gram, or like how would you start somebody with, this is the low end, don't go below it, versus this is the high end safely to where to work through? And does body weight play effect into that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So kind of like across the board with the literature right now, there's kind of like the 30-gram carb per hour recommendation if you're doing, 60 to 90 minutes of an effort. And then if you're doing 90 to 2 to 2.5 hours duration, then shoot for 60 grams of carbs per hour. And then if you're going in excess of 2.5 to 3 hours, then aim for 90 grams of carbs per hour. That's kind of the literature general recommendations. But again, there's plenty of athletes taking in upwards of 110, 120. My one client that's at a 180. So you certainly can consume more, but talking about the body weight side of things is interesting, because if you think about, like, I have a 200-pound 6'2" cyclist, and he burns 1,000 calories per hour when he's cycling. And then I have a 5'2" female who's, I think, like 120, and she puts out like 600, 700 calories, maybe an hour. So if you think about that and you take 1,000 calories just to make things easy and imagine that was all carbohydrates, that's 250 grams of carbs. He could probably, my 6'2", 200-pound cyclist could consume to break even. He certainly won't be doing that, but but just for kind of, to give you a gauge there. And then my smaller female athlete who's burning, say, 600, that on the high end is only 150 grams of carbs. So we carb loaded, and then we're going to be fueling during. When we're fueling during, we're really just trying to minimize the rate of loss from our muscle and not run into that bonking sensation. So if this female athlete wanted to work up to 150 from a gut training perspective, I think she certainly could if she wanted to. I don't think it's necessary, because we are going to be using some free fatty acids. We're going to be breaking down a little bit of muscle. That's going to happen primarily when you're in a racing situation. You're pushing at an effort that's going to be very glycolytic, meaning you're going to be using a lot of your stored carbohydrates and what's coming in. So for her, I mean, she could certainly work upwards of like 80% of that 120, I think, would be like the high end she would probably work towards. So, and I would say you certainly don't need to go lower than 30. grams
Yeah.
of carb. Like you wouldn't do that during racing. You might not finish. So, so just kind of thinking about that range. And if you look at your output on the bike or on your power meter in calories, divide that by 4. Imagine that was all carbohydrates. That kind of helps give you an idea.
Yeah. You know, and one part to think about is like, so let's say you have an athlete who weighs 115 to 130 pounds, right? And I think the one thing that I hear about is like you can exceed certain levels of osmolality, or that's going to like increase GI discomfort, dehydration, and that aspect. So, but let's say we can get a female to take in 90 to 100 grams of carbohydrates an hour. How do they do that with, you know, fluid, like how much fluid they can take on? Like, do you separate, okay, I'm gonna have a drink mix and gels? Like how do you even consume that much versus, and is osmolality even important?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the osmolality thing is something that was looked at for quite a while, and there seemed to be some proof in the pudding, right? But what we're starting to realize is that proof in the pudding was these individuals who maybe were not eating a whole lot of high carb in their day to day.
Hmm.
And then they would go on race and they would consume these things that were proper osmolality and they were taken in easier. These in these studies, they were not certainly not pushing 90 grams of carbs per hour. I can tell you that. And so it was way lower. And yes, they were tolerating it well. But what we're seeing is you can very much train your gut. And when we train, it sounds like just a saying, but physiologically, you are changing your digestive system when you increase carbohydrates in your day-to-day diet and when you practice gut training. So by consuming more carbohydrates in your day-to-day diet and supporting your training output, you're upregulating the amount of carbohydrate receptors that line your small intestine. So when those carbohydrates get there, your body is ready to absorb those. You can take in a lot of volume of carbohydrates and it's not going to overwhelm those receptors and cause that like fluid backflow into the gut. The other piece that happens when you start gut training is you are going to increase your gastric emptying rate. So how quickly your stomach can empty into your small intestine. So we want to increase gastric emptying rate, but we also need to make sure we're upregulating the carbohydrate receptors in that small intestine once the carbohydrates get there, so they can be pulled out of the small intestine and into the bloodstream. So maybe, do you want me to explain what gut training is?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
kind of.
So well, I guess like that's kind of what gut training is doing to your body. And to gut train, you want to kind of, I mentioned starting 8 to 10 weeks before your race is what they've shown in a lot of the literature. Start prepping your gut, and you actually only need a gut train in 1 session per week. So really intentional carbohydrate and fluid loading, if you will. And what I tell my clients when they're gut training is it's like a training session. It's not going to feel great every time. So we're really intentionally pushing it. And so choose your sessions wisely that you want to do that in. Certainly in triathlon, you want to gut train in a bike and you want to gut train in a run. So you may be gut training twice a week, potentially pushing on that higher end. And so you want to find out where you're at. So if you right now are not taking in any nutrition during your training sessions, you would want to start, and maybe that starting is just 20 grams of carbs per hour. And if you are 10 weeks out from your race, can you bump that up to 30 grams of carbs next week? And what about 40 the following week, and then 50? And see if you can make these incremental jumps. I suggest choosing a variety of products that you can control those portions. So gels that are always 30 grams of carbs, that's hard to do 10-gram bumps per week. So bring in some chews or blocks or liquid nutrition or something like that and move slowly and think about over that hour, you're trying to get little feeds throughout. So you don't want to hit the 60-minute mark and then take down 60 grams of carbs. That's not the goal. We want to ideally get 20-minute interval feeds with our nutrition if possible. I know that's not always realistic on race day based off of the dynamics and the course and that kind of stuff, but try and shoot for that if you can.
Yeah.
And then you'll find out on race day that you can tolerate all that nutrition. And the other thing I suggest and try and have my athletes work towards is actually your final gut training session, try and consume more than you plan to use per hour on race day. So if your goal is 90 grams of carbs per hour, try and consume 110. And then on race day, when you have those race nerves and maybe it's warm out, that 90 grams of carbs is going to feel easier on your digestive system essentially at the end of the day.
Yeah. I think the takeaway there is like find your limit to what feels comfortable and then push a little bit more, push a little bit more that you can train that versus this is my limit. I'm not going to go above it. Because again, I think when we're talking about that in terms of performance and we look at it in terms of like pure numbers, like we look at our power meter and we can look at our kg burn, we can kind of get an idea of the carbohydrate burn off of that. And if we know through loading and intake, you're going to be out by the run, well, you need to work on increasing it or your run will never really be great unless you're going to ride at 50% of your FTP, super low, right? So I think that's a nice takeaway is that you have to train that and figure out that process. I think the last thing really is just solid foods during racing. I mean, chomps or blocks, those are carbohydrates, but I mean, when is it okay to take in a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or whatever, right? Like when is it appropriate or when is it? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. This is also, I think, very individual, but from the science lens and the literature to date, I'll tell you that recommendation, then I'll tell you what I've seen with my athletes. So literature says you start your race ideally like optimally hydrated, and then the further you get through that race, the more and more dehydrated you get, the more and more your core temperature is slightly becoming more elevated, which means the more the blood flow is not going to the gut, which means it's harder to digest things, which means you want to put things in the gut that are very easy to digest, which would mean very simple carbs, not a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And so that would then lend to say you might digest something that has maybe fats, fiber, or protein in it, or these solid foods earlier on in the race than you would later in the race. But experience from my clients, I've certainly seen, I had a client, she did, I think it was a 350K or some gravel race. And she wanted pizza bagel bites and potato chips, so far into it. So there is very much a flavor fatigue that can happen. And maybe you crave something else and you just physically cannot take in any more of the sweet nutrition and gels. And so I think it's kind of figuring out what can keep you fueled that you can still tolerate. And if you're going to use peanut butter and jellies on race day, practice with them because we know the gut's trainable. So, you might be able to get away with it.
Cool. I mean, I think the last thing is this kind of open-ended is like, what kind of mistakes do you commonly see with your athletes making, well, incoming athletes making with race day nutrition plans that they might have been doing that you've adjusted?
Yeah. I would say biggest thing is people keep the same fluid and sodium from race to race or a half to a full. They don't change it and run the numbers to determine what their fluid losses are going to be and their sodium requirements or the temperature difference. They'll race in 60 degrees and then they'll go do a race and it's 80 degrees and they'll think they can get away with consuming and taking the same number of bottles and that's certainly not the case. Your fluid and sodium requirements are going to change for every race. If the temperature is changing, if the duration is changing, your needs are going to change there. Once you have your carbs, those won't change. That if you've tolerated to a certain point, you can hold that and keep that to any race you go to. And what carbs you want to use, if it's a cooler race, kind of talking about blood flow going to the gut, you might tolerate more solid stuff. Maybe you want, I don't know, scratch bars, Rice Krispie bars, or Martin Solid or something like that is more tolerable in the colder temperatures. And then certainly it's not going to be the case in something like Kona.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of a big one is people, and I don't think anybody knows any better because the science there is really just emerging with the individuality with the sodium requirements and sweat testing and all of that stuff is just still breaching the surface right now.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I think about, well, there's two parts of it, but say Ironman Wisconsin here, I mean, our athletes train through the summer where humidity is incredibly high. It's super hot all the time. And so they're training with such high fluid intake levels because sometimes at 6 a.m. it could be incredibly hot. But then once around September hits, our temperatures plummet. where all of a sudden the temperatures they're training in could be 20 to 30 degrees cooler, where the plan that we've practiced all summer isn't the same weather that you're going to be training in. But then even like, yeah, but then like even in like most races, I mean, there could be a 20 to 30 degree swing from the swim start to the run enter. And so like even fluid demands will change, and that's not like a static thing. But that's
Right.
something that we deal with here, is how fluid needs to change
Yeah.
from seasonal aspects of it, because you're not
Yeah.
sweating, you know? So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say the other thing I see that is an interesting one is athletes will go to altitude where it's drier and they'll see salt on them for like the first
Mm.
time. And they're like, oh my goodness, I must be losing like so much more sodium up here. And it's actually purely because of the climate. You're not losing more salt. It's just the air is so dry, it's pulling the water off your skin and leaving the salt crystals behind so you can visibly see them, when before you probably trained in a climate that had higher moisture in the air and you couldn't see them. So that is something people will be racing and they'll just like start trying to slam the salt pills, and then they'll run into GI issues because their body doesn't need that.
Well, what about like people that live in Wisconsin, right? And they finish a ride and they have salt stains. Is that like your your diet is too high in salt, you're taking too little salt, you're taking too high of salt? Like, or is it like you have no idea if you have salt stains? Like can you yeah, like I'm sure everybody sees that, but I mean,
Yeah.
what's the view on that?
There's a lot of players, and you mentioned a couple of them. And certainly genetics is one. So how many sweat glands you literally have like per square inch on your body is individual, that's genetic. And then the sodium loss piece is somewhat stagnant, but if you were to do the day before like pizza and french fries, your body has a set balance and wants to stay at. Our bodies are so incredibly smart at keeping us alive. It's really incredible that it's going to off a lot more salt the next day when you are sweating. So if you were to sweat test after an unusual day of eating like significantly high salt, you would probably get an oddly high salt reading versus if you were, you know, not salting any of your food and making everything from home and eating relatively low sodium, you might get, you would get a totally different swing, I should say, on that. So that's why we all need to sweat sodium test and figure out what our losses are.
Yeah. And then this just leaves me one more question, is like, so sodium loading the day before an event, like, is that a
Mm.
no-go because you're just like putting so much more sodium into your body that you're used to, that then the next day you're just going to demand more of that you need? I mean, like, yeah, last question, I promise. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So with the sodium loading, a bit of that more kind of ties into fluid loading. And I think that's also client individual and certainly test. Part of the piece there is if you're going into a hot race, similar to carb loading, right? We're trying to stock away as much in our body because we're going to be depleting those resources. We're trying to delay that amount of depletion. Fluid loading, you do that with salt because salt's going to pull in the water. And so we are increasing our weight on the scale when we fluid load intentionally because we're trying to increase our blood plasma volume and the water stores we have in our body to delay dehydration. So we'll line up the start line slightly heavier, but we'll be able to potentially carry less fluids on us if we need to limit weight there, and delay that dehydration aspect. So you certainly can do it if it's going to be a hotter race. I have had a handful of clients that have a lot of success. The literature does suggest specific fluid recommendations in preparation for endurance events. So like the night before, 500 mils of an electrolyte beverage, but how much sodium content is that for you? Again, I think you need to fine tune. Race morning, another 500 mils right when you wake up, and then 20 to 30 minutes before race start, can we do another 300? So there's those kind of things. You certainly don't want to line up at the start line dehydrated.
Cool.
Yeah.
Any closing thoughts? I mean, we hit on a lot, like, we're like almost 90 minutes in. I mean, that was like a lot of really
Yeah.
great info, but I mean, I'm good. This was really good topic, really good talk.
Yeah. Lots of nuggets in there. All my
Yeah.
trade secrets.
And if anybody listening to this enjoys podcasts, Kyla has an amazing podcast, Nutritional Revolution. I mean, she's really good with uploading once a week, good info, good guests. So if you like listening to podcasts, go hit up that podcast as well. So
Yeah, yeah. We like to have on lots of researchers and athletes themselves that are implementing the nutrition in the real world and seeing how it's working out for them. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Cool.
Was there any more questions from your listeners?
We're good. Yeah.
We're all awesome. All right. Well, thanks so much for having me, you
Yeah.
guys.
Thanks for
This
coming
is
on.
awesome.
Have a
Just
good day.
ton of great questions. Yeah. Stay cool over there.
Sounds good. We'll see you.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.